The recording will be sent out to everyone after the webinar, and we'll also provide you with some additional documents with more background about the amendment. You should have received a copy of questions 1 and 2 in the amended language that will be enshrined in the Constitution if the amendment passes on April 2nd. We will be discussing this document later in the webinar. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat. And as noted, we will have a question and answer period at the end. Next slide. Okay, I'm Attorney Schwartz. I am an attorney and board member of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin and chair of the Impartial Justice and Nonpartisan Redistricting Committee that worked hard on the webinar. I will provide an overview of Wisconsin's Constitution and procedures for amending our Constitution, as well as the ramifications involved when our Constitution is amended. Our guest speaker tonight is Attorney Michael Haas, who is the city attorney for Madison. He served as the municipal attorney for Stoughton, Edgerton, and Milton. He later worked as a staff counsel and election division administrator at the Government Accountability Board before becoming the interim administrator at the Wisconsin Elections Commission in 2016. His experience includes handling legal and administrative issues related to the 2012 recall, the 2016 presidential and general election cycle, and the statewide recount of the 2016 presidential race. He is a respected expert in elections, ethics, and open government. The webinar is one of the many webinars that the League will be presenting on the raft of constitutional amendments that the legislature is proposing. The League has developed a Vote No campaign on this proposed amendment to ban private funds for an election administration. Slide 3, please. These are the questions that were sent on the document to you, if you have it in front of you. Otherwise, we can look at it on the board. We will talk more about it later in the webinar. Question 1 will be use of private funds. Hold on. Y'all look up there. Hold on a minute, please. Question 1, shall Section 7, Sub 1 of Article 3 of the Constitution be created to provide that private donations and grants may not be applied for, accepted, expended, or used in connection with the conduct of any primary, election, or referendum? Question 2, quote, shall Section 7, Sub 2 of Article 3 of the Constitution be created to provide that only election officials designated by law may perform tasks in the conduct of primaries, elections, and referendum? There are problems with the way the wording happens in these questions, and that's what we will be dealing with later. Future webinars will focus on the upcoming proposed amendments for the August primary and the November election, as well as those that are being proposed for 2025. We will discuss how the proposed amendments on the April ballot and subsequent proposed amendments are designed to enact contemporary and controversial social policies, which trigger separation of powers issues and restrict people's rights without concerns about the wisdom of the tactic. Attorney Haas will elaborate on a number of these things at the end of my discussion. We hope by the end of the webinar, you'll come to understand why the League urges you to vote no on the April proposed constitutional amendment. We believe it is necessary for all of us to understand the ramifications of this proposed constitutional amendment. Protecting our freedom to vote is a well-managed and well-funded election is the core of protecting our democracy. Next slide, please. Wisconsin's Constitution has lived a long time and relatively healthy life compared to most American state constitutions. Wisconsin has retained its 1848 Constitution, which is the oldest state constitution outside of New England. Our state constitution is the fundamental document that outlines Wisconsin's framework for governance, including the powers, structure, and limitations on the state government and individual and civil rights. We've amended our Constitution 148 times since 1848, a frequency that may at first blush sound high, but in fact, Wisconsin's amendment rate is lower than that of 28 states. In fact, many of Wisconsin's 148 amendments come under the category of housekeeping. That is, they pertain to operational matters of governance, or they replace previous sometimes obsolete amendments. Only rarely, since 1848, were amendments used to implement social or cultural policies or restrictions. Next slide, please. As in other states, Wisconsin's requirement to amend its constitution is that 2 consecutive legislators in 2 consecutive years must approve the same proposed amendment. It's on the screen, first consideration amendments and second consideration. So an amendment that is proposed in one legislative session by both houses and is approved by the majority of the members elected in each of the houses, that's considered a first consideration amendment. An amendment that is proposed in a consecutive legislative session the following year and approved by the majority of the members elected to each of the houses is referred to as the second constitution amendment. Once an amendment has passed both houses in the second year, the legislature submits it for placement on the ballot for the public. If the people approve it by a simple majority and ratify the amendment is shrined in the Constitution. The key idea behind this procedural requirement of the approval of 2 consecutive legislative sessions over a 2-year period is that the amendment would be reflective of the people's voices. But with a gerrymandered legislature, the odds of different representatives and senators holding seats in both sessions are slim to none, almost guaranteeing that the first constitutional amendment will become second constitutional amendment and then end up on the ballot. In fact, because of gerrymandering, the representatives and senators in the legislature have not changed much over the last number of years. Also significant is that many of the proposed constitutional amendments were initially bills Governor Evers vetoed. The legislature is also using the amendment process to convert statutory provisions into constitutional amendments. One has to question why the statutes already on the books need to be enshrined in the Constitution. While 148 amendments have been added to our Constitution since 1848, about one a year, the legislature has already passed 2 constitutional amendments in 2023, putting about 3 amendments on the ballot this year, and they're proposing 5 first consideration amendments already on the ballots for 2025, if passed as second constitutional amendments next year. A key issue is how to interpret this raft of amendments. How are we to evaluate these many proposed constitutional amendments? Are they designed to enshrine governance about the power structure and limitations on state government? Or are they designed to enshrine contemporary and controversial social policies that will bind future legislators for generations to come? Next slide. Are these many proposed amendments intended to limit the executive and judicial branches, such that the legislature will be able to impose its power on the other 2 branches? Well, the separation of powers doctrine refers to the division of governmental responsibilities into distinct branches. We all know that, but it's to limit any one branch from exercising the core functions of another branch. The Wisconsin Constitution empowers the governor to veto bills passed by the state legislature and empowers the legislature to override such a veto if at least 2/3 of both legislative houses vote to do so. The Wisconsin Constitution does not permit the governor to veto an amendment. There has not been an override of gubernatorial veto since 1985, almost 4 decades. This suggests that the state legislature, frustrated by its lack of a majority in both houses, has turned to another more permanent method of realizing their intentions by limiting and or bypassing the core functions of the executive and judicial branches. Constitutional amendments can only be reversed through the same legislative 2-year process or by a court order. The proposed amendment on the April ballot already been vetoed by Governor Evers in a bill in June of 2021, and those proposed for August and November and for next year reveal an emerging pattern of circumvention of the separation of powers. This end run around this executive and judicial branches has not been the historical practice in Wisconsin until recently. Advocates for the constitutional amendments claim these amendments to the Constitution are to protect Wisconsin's fundamental rights, that they are pro-democratic, and that they allow the public the opportunity to directly voice their final agreement with an issue. But the pattern of disrupting the separation of powers principle is serious, and it is one of the reasons that the League believes these many constitutional amendments need to be understood completely before we vote on them. Next slide, please. A brief survey of the constitutional amendments will reveal this pattern of circumvention. Last year, as noted, the legislature passed 2 amendments. One amendment set conditions for general release of persons charged with a crime. The second amendment implemented stricter requirements for setting bail for a person charged with a crime. The League urged the public to vote no, but both amendments passed and are now enshrined in the Constitution. Both amendments impose stricter requirements on the statutes already on the books. With neither of these amendments was the public made aware of serious legal and factual issues that were omitted in the questions that were presented on the ballot. The questions presented to the public about the conditions for release before conviction omitted key definitions as well as factual information about possible societal consequences, additional costs for local taxpayers, and the possible increase in the treatment of people of color. The question presented to the public about stricter requirements for setting cash bail did not reference the constitutional mandate of adherence to the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment or the excessive bail prohibition under the Eighth Amendment, and didn't include factual information about implications for a 2-tiered system of justice, the financial inequities in the state's bail system for low-income people, and racial disparities, or an increased cost for local jails. Furthermore, both of these amendments violated the separation of powers principle of our government because they intruded upon a core power of judges in exercising their discretionary judgment as to what conditions preclude release before conviction and what conditions are necessary for cash bail. Next slide, please. On the August 2024 primary ballot will be an amendment entitled Delegations of Appropriation Power and Allocation of Appropriation Power. Allocation of federal money. Sorry about that. This amendment is designed to transfer a core function of the executive branch to the legislature regarding the acceptance and distribution of federal funds to the state. Currently, this power is the executive branch power. Governor Veto's, again, already vetoed a bill on this matter in April of 2023. Had this transfer of power existed during COVID, the governor would not have been able to distribute federal funds for COVID protections for the public. Next slide, please. On the November 2024 election ballot will be an amendment entitled Eligibility to Vote. This amendment is designed to exert control over municipalities by denying non-citizens the ability to elect local officials and to vote on local affairs which directly affect their everyday life. Because allowing non-citizens to vote in municipal elections already exists in other states, this legislature is attempting to thwart this movement in Wisconsin. Non-citizen voting in local elections does nothing to change the law that only citizens can vote in state and national elections. Next slide. Now, we talked about those first consideration amendments, and these would be the ones that, if passed by a second consideration and the second year by the legislature in both houses, will end up being amendments that could end up on the ballot in 2025. I'm not going to list all of them, but I am going to talk a few minutes about these amendments. There are some policy positions that are controversial. You see from these amendments, there are some policy positions that are controversial and not governance issues that belong in the Constitution. As we've already seen, one of the amendments has already been passed as a bill and vetoed by the governor in 2021. With the new legislative maps just signed into law, which will be in place for the November 2024 election, hopefully these first considerations will not receive a second consideration vote and therefore will not appear on the ballot. A few of them are basically to not be able to close houses of worship during a public emergency, stopping ranked choice voting. There are a number of proposed amendments that are serious and are basically policy positions and not governance positions. Okay, slide 11. For all the legislative statements about the constitutional amendments being pro-democracy and good for the state, it's legitimate to ask why the legislature will not trust us to have ballot initiatives, which Wisconsinites have demanded in order to have a final say on a large number of issues that we want for our state. Ballot initiatives are the way to trust the people of Wisconsin and hear directly what voters want for our state, as occurred in Ohio when it was successful to help defeat the legislators' attempt to increase the 50% threshold to 60% threshold in order to thwart Ohio's ballot initiative on abortion rights. The voters defeated the legislators' attempt to silence the people's voices, and Ohio enshrined abortion rights in their constitution. Not only has the legislature refused ballot initiatives, but it just made the local advisory referendum illegal, which has been what Wisconsinites have used for years to make clear our position on issues such as fair, transparent representative and congressional maps, an independent redistricting commission, a national constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, get money out of politics, to name a few among many. A few words are in order about election administration in Wisconsin. As many of you know, election administration is complex. Banning private funds for election administration shifts the burden of these costs to the taxpayers when local governments cannot fill the gap in funding. So what citizen election expenses are possibly at risk if this proposed amendment to ban private funds passes in April? You need to distinguish between paying for the cost of one election and paying for the cost of many elections. The cost of one election is the cost of the personnel, equipment, and supplies needed to conduct an election during the relatively brief period when people are voting. The cost of all elections is all the administrative, maintaining the election infrastructure and preparing for future elections, plus the additional cost of conducting each election. The administrative costs include maintaining and securing the voter registration database, maintaining, testing, and securing voting equipment, maintaining and securing computer systems that manage districting and election night reporting of results, and training election officials. Conducting elections is the responsibility of local governments. Therefore, the bulk costs are financed through general tax revenues, primarily property and state taxes collected at the local level. State budgets contribute very little to the operational costs of conducting elections. In fact, a bill is pending that would require the Wisconsin Election Commission to repay local governments for certain costs involved with administrating special elections, which cause even greater strain on county and local budgets for specific items like poll worker salaries and printing and mailing absentee ballots materials. But no such bill has yet to pass. More about the cost of specific costs of election funding in Wisconsin will be addressed by Attorney Haas. One last issue needs to be addressed, and that is the problematic language and the wordings of questions 1 and 2, because the language that will go into the Constitution and be amended is different. And we don't normally know that when we go to vote. The questions simply do not include all the relevant information needed to vote intelligently. And the language that will end up in the Constitution, if the amendment passes, includes more information that makes the proposed amendment more problematic for our elections. Next slide, please. And you can follow along if you have the documents that was sent to you this afternoon, or it's up on the screen and we'll go through it right now. Question 1, which is what I read before, but we'll go through it again and then talk about how it changes in the Constitution if it passes. Quote, question 1, quote, shall Section 7, Sub 1 of Article 3 of the Constitution be created to provide that private donations and grants may not be applied for, accepted, expended, or used in connection with the conduct of any primary election or referendum. The language that will actually go in the Constitution if this passes is Section 7, Sub 1, and it will read, quote, no state agency or officer or employee in state government and no political subdivision of the state or office or employee of a political subdivision may apply for, accept, expend, or use any monies or equipment in connection with the conduct of any primary election or referendum if the monies or equipment are donated or granted by an individual or non-governmental entity. Ballot question number 1 doesn't mention that no monies can be donated or granted for equipment in connection with the conduct of any primary election or referendum. The omission of the word equipment from the ballot question is quite serious. The most visible capital spending item in conducting elections is voting equipment, mostly scanners to process paper ballots. Purchasing new equipment used to cast and count votes is costly. Equipment also includes the longer range costs of administrative costs of maintaining the election infrastructure and preparing for future elections. The plain language appears to prevent even election officials from even using tables, chairs, electrical outlets, or say any other equipment or facilities present at polling places that are privately owned, such as churches, private school buildings, community centers, or privately owned locations. If the language is intended to be this inclusive, it could completely upset election officials' ability to find an adequate number of polling places by limiting that search to only government-owned facilities. Next slide. This is the second question that will be on our ballot. The question, again, will read, shall Section 7, Sub 2 of Article 3 of the Constitution be created to provide that only election officials designated by law may perform tasks in the conduct of primaries, elections, and referendum? The language as amended in the Constitution is slightly different. Quote, no individual other than an election official designated by law may perform any task in the conduct of any primary election or referendum. The question is really posed here. Just who is an election official? It's not entirely clear, and neither are the words task and conduct clear. They're not defined. So we have to ask, who cannot help with elections if this amendment passes? What effect would this amendment have on election observers, election workers, volunteers? How will nonprofit organizations like the League be affected? Will its ability to provide education to the public in elections be because the League is not be prevented because the League is not an official election official? Attorney Haas will now discuss the serious questions about this amendment. Not only that, but will provide specific funding information about election administration in Wisconsin and the use of private funds in our elections. Attorney Haas, welcome.
You're muted.
Attorney Haas, you are muted.
Thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction, Joan. I'm happy to be here tonight. Thanks for giving me some time. I'm going to see if I can share my screen again. Did that work?
That's perfect.
Thank you. Okay. I just want to at the outset say that these are my personal views, having been involved in elections for quite a while. And in my current position, the city of Madison has not taken any formal position. Excuse me. The city of Madison has not taken any formal position on these referendum questions, but I do want to thank the league for its focus on these questions and for your campaign to encourage no votes on these questions. If any of you have heard me speak about elections before, I need to start with what I think is really the heartbeat of our elections, which is the municipal clerks. We have 1,850 municipal clerks in Wisconsin that conduct our elections, as many of you probably know. Unlike most states that run elections at the county level, 2/3 of those clerks are part-time and 25% turnover every year. So if you think of that, around 450 new clerks every year that the State Elections Commission needs to train and conduct elections, and they're expected to conduct elections the same as if they had been in office for 20 years. I have a very long list of what clerks do, but I tried to summarize here. Having expertise in election law, budgeting, staffing, purchasing, logistics, facilities management, IT, cybersecurity, public relations, and recently, of course, public health. And as I like to say, often this is a part-time job. This is the front line of preserving democracy, and the whole world is looking over your shoulder. The other aspect I think of elections that is important to understand is just how complex it has gotten, especially over the last 2 decades. And this started largely with the Help America Vote Act of 2002. As many of you probably can recall, the Bush v. Gore election and recount led to this congressional act, which required every state to create and maintain an electronic voter registration system, which we call WisVote in Wisconsin. It also helped to update this voting equipment certification process and tried to improve accessibility of elections for voters. In Wisconsin, there was a big transition because if you lived in a municipality with less than 5,000 people, you did not even have to register to vote unless the municipality had its own ordinance. Under state law, there is no voter registration requirement for those municipalities. Now, we check data of voters, of registered voters with DMV. We check to see if they are a convicted felon, if a court has ruled that they are held incompetent to vote, or if they voted, registered to vote, or voted in a number of other states. We have very detailed and complex laws for photo ID and absentee voting, and clerks that are constantly dealing with court decisions and legislation that is enacted. And I just reflect on, if you look back 2 decades and how all you did was, in many municipalities, was walk in and tell them your name and address, and you got a ballot. And it seems like now the more precise we get about parsing out individual voter data, the more some members of the public want us to even be more precise and put up more obstacles to voting. Just as a kind of a rough indicator of what clerks deal with, there are 2 sort of main Bibles for election administration that the Elections Commission produces and updates. One is the Election Administration Manual, which is about 250 pages, and the Election Day Manual is about 200 pages. Those are just 2 of several manuals that they are expected to master. There are manuals on how they operate in WisVote, special voting deputy processes, how to conduct recalls and recounts. And clerks, and I always remind people, many of them are part-time clerks, are expected to know how to manage all of this for every election. So if we turn to funding now, and I wanted to give that context for funding and the assistance that clerks really need. Federal funding over the years has been sporadic, it's unpredictable, and especially with regard to municipalities, it's really restricted and limited in its use. The original Help America Vote Act funding included $57 million for Wisconsin. All of this money, though, was targeted to state level initiatives. In other words, for the state elections agency to hire staff and to create an electronic voter registration system and to improve testing and certification processes for voting equipment. All that money was spent up to around 2017 or 2018, I believe, when I was still at the elections agency at the time, I think, when we finally ran out of those funds. And then since 2018, Congress has allocated an additional $17.2 million to Wisconsin, focused on election security needs. And this funding has been, again, sporadic and unpredictable. The state never knows from one year to another whether Congress is going to be providing additional election security funds. The State Elections Commission has distributed over $10 million to county clerks and municipal clerks in grant programs. These grant programs have been to help buy computer equipment, to harden computer systems, secure websites, and local websites and email systems, and for election security training, and to purchase accessibility voting equipment. But each of these grants has been up to a maximum of $1,200, and sometimes it's a few $100s if you imagine spreading that out amongst 1,850 municipalities. Turning to state and federal funding, of course, municipalities rely on property tax revenue largely and shared tax revenue from the state. And the state funding is restricted, as you probably know, by levy limits, strict levy limits, restricting the amount of funds that municipalities can raise by the property tax and by the shared revenue formula. I included here just a few samples of Dane County municipalities and their election budgets. Madison's election budget for this year is estimated at $2 million, although it's very hard to really pin down because of the number of agencies that are involved other than the clerk's office in helping to prepare for the elections, and because the funds are spread out over many different budget lines. Madison, by the way, has 107 polling places established for this April's election. Sun Prairie, outside of Madison, has 8 polling places. Their budget for this year is a little over $277,000. The town of Medina is right outside of Marshall, Wisconsin, in eastern Dane County. They have an election budget of $5,000. So I also listed here the grants that these municipalities received from private grants in 2020. As you can see, the town of Medina grant was $5,000, equaling their budget for this year, and that was a minimum grant amount issued by the Center for Tech and Civic Life. We'll talk about Madison's grant more specifically a little bit later, but these budget figures, as Joan mentioned, some of the election-specific costs and the longer-term costs. The biggest capital costs, these budget figures do not include costs for things like voting equipment and other equipment. Madison in 2016 purchased 97 tabulators at a cost of about $5,700 each, along with 90 express vote accessible pieces of equipment and other related equipment. That was a one-time purchase of $805,000. So I hope this gives you a little bit of context for the complexity and the way that elections have become more demanding on clerks, and that has only increased with technology changes, election security concerns, misinformation, and the increased public scrutiny that clerks have faced. So I want to take you back, unfortunately, to 2020 at the onset of the pandemic. The April election, of course, is in those early days. I was at the state elections agency. Municipalities were seeing a loss of poll workers due to concerns about congregations of people. Personal protective equipment was scarce. If you recall going to the grocery stores, and there are limits on what you could buy as far as cleaning equipment, and sanitizing equipment. There's a major increase in absentee voting, because again, of concerns about gathering. There's confusion about the photo ID requirement from many first-time absentee voters. There's also confusion about absentee voting timelines, and even uncertainty about whether the April election would ever even be held. The National Guard was called out to help assist as poll workers. They helped deliver personal protective equipment and hand sanitizer to each county, and then that was distributed to municipalities. For me, one experience really crystallizes this, which is the evening before the April election. I was in a meeting of the Wisconsin Elections Commission. At that time, there were cases pending before the Wisconsin Supreme Court and the US Supreme Court to determine whether or not an election would even be held the next day. And clerks, probably wanting to get extra rest that night, may have gone to bed not even knowing if there would be an election the next day. And I just remember sitting in that meeting thinking that this is no way to run a democracy. As you probably know, Madison and many other municipalities received grants from the Center for Tech and Civic Life. In 2020, these were intended to assist municipalities in conducting the election during the pandemic. And this was in the wake of the April presidential primary. I think Wisconsin may have been the only state to hold a presidential primary in the midst of that pandemic. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty about the trajectory of the pandemic when there is not yet a vaccine in sight. This is a photo, I guess, that also crystallizes for me what was happening at that time. This is the production of hand sanitizer, which was being distributed all across the state through the National Guard. If you look closely at the bottom photo, you will see that this is being produced by a vodka distillery. And so the state contracted with several vodka distilleries to convert their vodka or their alcohol into hand sanitizer to be used at the April election. More specifically, the city of Madison, as I mentioned, received $1.27 million in grant funds to be used for the fall elections. And this itemizes where those grant funds went. The largest share to poll worker recruitment and to increasing the pay for poll workers as an incentive to have them work during the pandemic. And then other costs for temporary staffing, polling place rental and cleaning, voter education, and you can see the rest of the list, which includes absentee ballot drop boxes, which have since been deemed to be or prohibited by the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Just some photos here to illustrate what this money was being used for. The map on the upper left, I know it's hard to see, but this shows all of the absentee ballot polling places used in the city of Madison. We have a picture of one of our absentee ballot boxes being installed. Then we have photos of one of the in-person absentee voting sites. To the extent we could, the city of Madison tried to conduct those outside when weather would allow. And then a photo of one of our sort of infamous Democracy in the Park events where voters could return their absentee ballots to any Madison City Park during 2 weekends, ballots that they had received in the mail. Okay, so this year and last year, the city of Madison received another $1.5 million from the same nonprofit organization to spend on elections through the end of this year. The city is purchasing a substantial piece of equipment and technology to allow for high-speed sorting and assembly of the absentee ballot mailings. This will save up to $140,000 each election, which is the cost of hiring temporary staff to prepare these absentee ballot mailings, and will be much more efficient and accurate and ensure that the correct ballots get in the right envelopes. The city is purchasing that equipment in advance of the April election, so that we don't have questions about whether or not that is valid depending on the outcome of the referendum. Focusing now on the questions, the referendum questions. As Joan said, a yes vote, a result would prohibit the use of any private grant funds or equipment donated by a private organization. So some questions I proposed are, how broadly is this going to be interpreted? What about polling places that are essentially donated or provided free of charge to municipalities by churches or nonprofit organizations or businesses? Those are private organizations. Is the city going to be required to pay the fair market value of those spaces to rent those facilities? And it's not uncommon for food to be donated for poll workers. Is this going to be prohibited? Will it only be prohibited if somebody donates cash for the food, but not if free pizzas are provided for the poll workers? Some concerns I've raised about question one. First of all, as you can see from the city of Madison expenditures, which were similar to other municipalities, these grant funds have only been used for nonpartisan election administration purposes. These same expenses would have been valid expenses of public funds. Many municipalities used up their entire 2020 election budget in the April election and had no other remaining funds for the rest of the year. As Joe mentioned, these private grants can fill gaps when we have scarce and unpredictable funding at the federal, state, and local levels. I will remind us that during COVID, the state legislature decided not to meet for the last 10 months of the year, while clerks were desperately scrambling to pull off an election. As Joe mentioned, private grants lessen the burden on taxpayers. And of course, we have many private-public partnerships in Madison that are essential for facilities to operate, like the Overture Center, Obrick Botanical Gardens, a pool that we have, foundations that support the library and the parks, and even certain programs of our police department. Moving to question two quickly. This seems to be all motivated by the experience of the city of Green Bay in 2020. They had several consultants assist them with the election in addition to receiving private grants. One of them ran into a little controversy. This consultant made recommendations to city staff regarding their central count training manual and best practices for other election procedures. He initially assisted workers at the central count location on election day. Eventually, the Wisconsin Elections Commission directed him to stop this activity. And because of sort of the controversy surrounding it, the city completed a 20-page post-election report that concluded that this individual had no decision-making authority and did not assist with any matters involving actual ballots. To me, this appears to be the sole motivation for changing our Wisconsin Constitution with regard to that question. So as Joan indicated, there's questions about the definition of election officials that could complete election tasks under this amendment. Currently, only city clerk or municipal clerks and county clerks, poll workers, and members of the various canvass boards are defined as election officials in the statutes. The question also comes up about what conduct by other individuals would be prohibited. And the question only defines it as task in the conduct of primaries, elections, and referendum. So that's a pretty broad definition. I, by the way, do not believe it would impact work of organizations such as the league that are doing voter information and outreach. Although that's just my interpretation, you don't know how broadly some people will want to define it and challenge actions. So my concerns about question 2 is, again, I think it's really proposing a solution in search of a problem. This has not been an issue throughout Wisconsin. We have this one incident in Green Bay where the individual did not have any direct control over decisions or actions of election officials and was not involved in touching ballots. More generally, it doesn't define either election officials or affected tasks. It doesn't even say that the staff of a clerk's office can do these tasks, and they are not typically sworn election officials. We also have staff of many other agencies who assist in preparing and pulling off an election. In Madison, our clerk gave me a list of 15 other city agencies that are involved in elections, from public works to the police department to engineering, finance, IT. The question would be, are these agencies prohibited from assisting the clerk's office? And then often we have voting equipment vendors who are on site at an election to troubleshoot problems related to their voting equipment, especially when it's the first time that it's been used by a municipality. We have other contractors like mailing houses that some municipalities use. What about a contract with a company that is producing hand sanitizer? Again, you can think of ways that this might be interpreted in ways that it may not be intended. More broadly, I think this relates to both question 1 and question 2. The Wisconsin constitutional language regarding elections is really limited and restricted to what I think are essential decisions like voter eligibility, candidate eligibility, and authorizing the legislature to pass on specific policy issues. Question 1 and question 2 would really insert a policy decision, which in my view is not related to fundamental rights of electors or qualifications of candidates or elected officials. So I just raised a question. Joan talked about the separation of powers concern. I think that's a good legal question, but beyond that, just, what is the import of having this policy decision in the Wisconsin Constitution? To me, it seems to be of less substantive import than the rest of the Constitution. And maybe decisions that might be more likely to be changed depending on who the elected officials are as policy decisions. So I apologize. I think I ran a little bit over my allotted time, but I appreciate the time, and I'm happy to try to help with any questions.
No problem, Attorney Haas. It was just fine. Thank you for your expertise and clarity in explaining the ramifications of this proposed constitutional amendment on election administration in Wisconsin. Finally, we have Molly Carmichael, Communications Director of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. She'll now provide information about how we can all get involved in disseminating information about the League's Vote No campaign.
Thank you, and hi everyone. So good to see so many familiar and new faces on a Tuesday evening to learn about constitutional amendments. And I'm only going to be with you all for a few minutes because I know we have lots of excellent questions in the chat. But like Joan said, we're going to talk about how we can get vote no outside of this group, how we can tell our friends, our family, and really utilize our power as voters and in our communities. All right, so like I've put in the chat and said at the top of the program, this recording, lots of other additional materials will all be available to you folks after this program and, after I upload it on YouTube and all that stuff. Another thing that will be available to you all is this toolkit, which I hope everyone will find useful. So in this toolkit, you'll find some main takeaways. So some of the top line reasons to vote no that you heard today. You'll find messaging. So whether messaging you want to use when you're having a conversation with a friend, something you want to post on your personal social media, which is always excellent, as well as content to share. So I tried to make some fun GIFs, some videos, some stencil graphics that, like I said, posting on your social media, sharing on a Nextdoor account, posting to Facebook in a Facebook group are always excellent actions, because a lot of the times folks maybe don't even know that there are constitutional amendment questions on their ballot. So just spreading awareness and then opening up those conversations is always a great thing to do. And then finally, like I've been saying, taking actions, some mini volunteer actions that only take a few minutes. We have some ideas, some that I just mentioned, having a discussion circle, and we are actually going to do one soon for like a minute or two. All right, so like I said, you'll get the toolkit and all of the other great stuff, including the slides from today. But if anyone wants to take just 10 seconds to put your phone up to the screen and access the toolkit, feel free to, but also no worries if not, because you'll get it in an email from me really soon. And this toolkit plus all of the other great toolkits we have, mostly on elections, are available on lwvwi.org, fittingly under the toolkits and resources tab. All right, I'm gonna go to the next slide. So like I said, often our friends are our most trusted sources, and assuming that you're here today, you're getting ready for the election, you're learning about these questions. I'm sure lots of you are very trusted among your friends. I know whenever it's election day, my friends are always texting me, what should I do? What does this question mean? What are you doing? So kind of as being that person in the friend group, in the neighborhood, we are going to do something called friend banking. So that way we can get more people to vote no this April. So friend banking is kind of like what it sounds if you've ever done a text bank, except in a text bank, you are usually using some sort of app and texting random numbers. I'm sure you get like 15 a day like I do. But a friend bank is a bit more warm and fuzzy because you are picking your loved ones and you are just kind of starting a conversation with them. It's a pretty low lift. I know it can be kind of scary to reach out to someone unsolicited and tell them, here's how I think you should vote in April. So, always good to start with someone who loves you no matter what you text them, and then kind of ease your way into it. So obviously we have some ideas here: spouse, partner, your bestie, your kids, that will love you no matter what. Hopefully you text them, vote no. If you have any group chats with friends, brunch buddies, like I said, just kind of, if you're new to this, just kind of ease your way into it and start with the people closest to you. So we're actually just going to take just about a minute because we have lots of questions. And I'm going to put a script in the chat right now. And so this is a sample that we worked up as something that you could text your friends to get a conversation going and to encourage them to vote no. By no means do you have to copy and paste it. It might be convenient to copy and paste it, but if you want to cut it down, if you want to do something more personal, more organic, by all means, just make sure it has the election date as well as that you're voting no in it. So please copy and paste that, open up your phones, or you could also email. It could be like a friend email thing. And we are just going to take a minute, and I'm encouraging everyone to text at least one person right now while we're all in the Zoom together. And then after you send a text, an email, voice memo, whatever, use the little reaction and just like a little thumbs up, a little heart. The text did not, are people not seeing the text in the chat? I can put it one more time. Okay, the most recent. Do folks not see that?
I see it, Molly.
Okay, I'll put it one more time. Okay, I put it, okay, great. I just put it for the third time. So when you see a really long comment in the chat, that's me. Okay, awesome. Thank you all. So yeah, like I said, we'll just take a minute. I was gonna play some music, but by the time I do that, the minute will be up. And yeah, please use a little heart reaction so we can kind of gauge how many texts we're sending and you know, doing some in Zoom organizing with each other. Totally. And I get some people might be on their phones and might be hard to switch back and forth. So, you know, feel free to screenshot or just set a reminder. Pledge to do it right after you get off of Zoom. Awesome. And while folks are finishing up, great. I see some people have pasted it in their notes so they can do it right after. Awesome. Yay. Thanks, everyone. Another great action that's in the toolkit that we have a template for that I will just shout out is a letter to the editor. Especially, you know, focusing on the really local publications in your area. I think those are always a really powerful tool. But I will stop sharing my screen because I know we have some good questions to get to. So thank you all.
Thank you very much, Molly. I'd like to comment at this point. It hasn't been mentioned yet, but that private funding has been ruled legal in Wisconsin. So it is not even illegal to be doing this. Keep that in mind.
I would
Just
quickly, Joan, I would just quickly say all over the country, it's been legal in the face of many, many legal challenges.
thank you. Correct. So just as a close, each municipality should have the prerogative to either accept or deny private funding according to the needs of each election and for its general infrastructure needs for elections. Since elections are held locally, there's no need for the state to mandate such a constitutional amendment that would basically negatively affect all the municipalities and cities in Wisconsin. Now is the time for us to be mindful of the foundational principles of the Constitution of our state constitution that have averaged approximately only one state constitutional amendment a year. Now is the time also to be mindful that we honor and preserve our constitutional principles. And now is the time to be mindful that our Constitution not become the repository for a flurry of controversial, restrictive social policies with misleading and ambiguous language that our gerrymandered legislature is proposing, which if passed would be enshrined in our Constitution. And now is definitely the time before you get your absentee ballots for the upcoming election that we all vote no on this proposed constitutional amendment. And now we will open up for questions and as many questions as we can get in. Okay.
Molly, can you stop the recording, please?
Yes.
Sure. And by the way, this recording will be sent, as I said earlier, to all of you.